What's going on, friends? We have talked a lot about camshafts on this channel. Camshafts are one of the most popular next step upgrades after you get exhaust, air cleaner, and a tune. But one thing that continues to come up is basically what camshaft is right for my bike, and what is a bolt-in cam, and what is a high lift cam, and what are the differences. So guys, without getting too technical, the one thing we want to really understand is that bolt-in cams are basically what a manufacturer believes is going to bolt directly into your bike without any clearance issues, without anything else that is going to work with your stock valve train components. You really don't have to do anything else to the motorcycle other than tune it with a bolt-in cam. Now, is bolt-in really bolt-in? Yeah, for the most part. Guys, before we get too far into today's video, please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. So, generally, bolt-in cams are just that. They're going to bolt right into the bike with no issues. But if you're doing it yourself, the number one thing that you want to do first is go ahead and put those cams in the cam chest and rotate them around a little bit, and just make sure that that base circle on the cam isn't going to interfere with the cases. Now, sometimes you will have a little interference with the cases because no two engines are exactly 100% alike. Sometimes you might have a casting that's got a little bump in it, whatever. No two engines are exactly perfectly alike. So even with a bolt-in cam, you want to dry fit them basically, rotate them around, and if there are any clearance issues with the cases, bust out the old die grinder, knock that little bump off that case or whatever, get it to turn freely in there, and you're good to go. Just don't trust that bolt-in means I can just slap these in there and run on down the road. So other than really just clearance and fitment issues, that is the main thing you want to look at. But for the most part, bolt-in cams are just that. Bolt-in cams are designed to go into basically a stock motor, meaning you have the stock compression, stock valve springs, your stock push rods. You really don't have to do anything else to the engine other than just directly swap the cam in. Now, with some cams, especially wood cams, you are going to need some adjustable push rods, and in fact, with a lot of their bolt-in cams, adjustable push rods are a requirement. But other than that, stock valve springs, stock compression ratios, they do very well. Now, with wood cams, even their bolt-in cams, don't let that fool you. Their bolt-in cams are generally not like super mild. Those cams really have some huge performance benefits. Now, while they will work with your stock compression, they will give you some incredible power over stock. You can even take their bolt-in cams and go with some higher compression pistons, and they will really come to life. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum is our high lift cams. And high lift cams are just that. They are very high lift, long duration cams, and your stock valve springs are just not going to handle those. So when it comes to a high lift cam, you don't want to just go put those in your stock bike and just put a new set of valve springs on it. Those cams are really designed for higher compression. Mainly a lot of those cams, the more compression you have, the better they're going to work. Now, I will caution you with the higher lift cams, they're going to be quite a bit noisier than the bolt-in cams. Granted, the wood cams, even the bolt-in cams, they are very noisy, but that's because they have some pretty harsh ramp angles and they do nose off pretty quickly. But you do get an incredible amount of power out of them. Now, with the high lift cam, as I mentioned, you really got to add some compression with these. A lot of the high lifts are really designed for compression that's 10 to 1 and higher. And generally, 10 to 1 and higher, that's where these really perform the best. But when it comes to a high lift cam, you still want to go ahead and kind of dry fit them into the engine, make sure there's no clearance issues or anything else. But at the same time, you are definitely going to have to change your valve springs out. Go with something like the Beehive spring pack, because if you try to use those with the stock valve springs, they're not going to be stiff enough. And you're pretty much, for lack of a better, you're just going to lose control of your valves, and then they get bent and bad things happen. and then it becomes very expensive, and if you make a mistake inside the engine, a bad day when you have an engine open up and you've done some engine work, my experience has been very expensive to say the least. So high lift cams work best with more compression, 10.5 to 1 or higher, and definitely with a high lift cam, these are a little harder on the valve train. So we've got our upgraded springs in there. I would highly recommend going with a good aftermarket set of lifters. I really don't like to run a high lift cam with factory lifters. Go out and get you a good set of Gems or S&S. They have more needle bearings, bigger needle bearings, and overall they're just really much more well equipped. The internals of the lifters, they're built a lot better than the factory lifters. They will really handle a high lift cam. Because if you guys know anything about the CVO 110s, and we've talked about this quite a bit, the CVO 110 with the Screaming Eagle 255 cam, basically the CVO cam, those things trash lifters. And that's not even a wild cam. That's not even a super high lift cam, but they seriously will do some damage to factory lifters. And unfortunately, if you have a twin cam 110, that is the factory lifters in there. You don't have the Screaming Eagle lifters, and that is one of the failure points of the twin cam 110 is the lifters with the 255 cam. So if you're going with a high lift camshaft and you're going to do the springs in the heads, definitely look at a good set of lifters. Now, to the other point with high lift cams, those cams really, as I mentioned, they work very well with higher compression. In fact, they're really designed for that. Also, that's when you're really getting to the point where you spend that extra money on the valve springs, you get a high lift cam. It's really to your benefit to have your heads ported, or if you really just want to buy a new set of heads, like something from S&S, or get a set of Fuel Moto's ported heads off their part shelf, that's really going to be to your benefit with a high lift cam. Because it's bolting a high lift cam in with valve springs in your factory heads, in my opinion, you're really not going to be gaining much over just a bolt-in camshaft. You really need that head porting and that increased flow to really take advantage of that high lift cam. But same rules apply with high lift cams. You still kind of want to dry fit them, make sure you don't have any clearance issues in there. Make sure everything's going to work and work well, because like I mentioned, the last thing you want is to have any kind of clearance issues that you weren't aware of, and you put them in there, you bolt everything back together, and then you hit that start button, and then disaster strikes. And also, after you put a camshaft in, I like to pull the spark plugs out and have somebody, or rotate that rear wheel yourself, and just kind of listen to the motor, make sure everything turns freely. If there's any binding or anything, don't force it over. Stop, just stop right there, take it back apart, and check your work. Because you can be your own hero by stopping and checking your work. If you feel something binding up a little bit, don't hit the start button. Because once you hit the start button, it's pretty much game over. You're starting over anyhow, and it's going to cost you a metric butt ton of money. Ask me how I know. So between high lift cam and bolt-in cam, what's right for your bike? If you plan on keeping the stock compression ratio, you've got exhaust, tune, and an air cleaner, and you really don't plan on going any further than that, bolt-in cam is great. Bolt-in cam is great with mild heads and stock compression, and even with bolt-in cams, you can even go up to 10 to 1 compression really without any issues. Sometimes, even like with the wood cams, bolt-in cams, you can go up to 10.5 to 1. Now, the high lift cams, I really like those if you want to go for some heavy-duty compression, 10 to 1 or higher. You're going to get a serious head porting job, or you're going to go out and buy a set of ported heads like from S&S. That's really where the high lift cam really comes into play. Because don't waste your money on a high lift cam and valve springs in your stock heads. You're really not going to be gaining anything. I mean, you get a little bit, but not really much to justify the cost of getting the springs changed out in the heads and then bumping your compression. I do often get asked, like, what is the best camshaft for my bike? Well, it depends on how you ride and what you ride. You know, technically you could put any camshaft in any bike, whether it be a Softail, a Dyna, or even a touring bike. You could put a high RPM camshaft into a touring bike if you want. But your low end's going to suffer, but you're going to love it on the top end if that's where you ride. And vice versa. You got a lighter bike on a Dyna, you can put a high torque cam in that, no problem. So when it comes to camshafts, it just depends on what you ride and how you ride it. So camshafts are not a one-size-fits-all, so you definitely want to do your research and pick the right one. And I really do appreciate when you guys ask me the question like, hey, what's the right camshaft for my bike? And I come back and I ask you, okay, how do you ride? What's your RPM range and what bike are you riding? What are you looking to do with it? And based on that, it makes it a lot easier for me to recommend a camshaft for you that's going to be right for you and the way you ride. So anyhow, guys, I really hope that kind of helped you out with like the difference between the bolt-in and the high lift. And I get a lot of questions on, should I get this bolt-in cam or what about this camshaft? And it's like, well, no, wait a minute. That's a high lift cam. What are you planning on doing here? Are you going to do heads? Are you going to do high compression? You can actually just get away with a bolt-in and then you don't have to do lifters and all this other stuff. So I really hope that kind of gave you guys a little insight onto where we're going with all these different cam talk out here. But anyhow, guys, that's all I've got for you this week. If you guys enjoyed the video, please don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. But anyhow, guys, until next week, you guys stay safe on the streets, ride smart, stay safe, and I'll catch you guys back here in next week's video. Thanks for watching.